Current technological developments have the power to determine the future for the world's 7.8 billion people. And this naturally raises questions of what the future should be, what's right, what principles are we to follow, and what life is worth living. Join Dr. Michael Klenk, Delft University of Technology, and Dr. Simon Longstaff, the Executive Director of the Ethics Centre, as they discuss the range of ethical questions raised by the use of data and data-driven technologies, with moderation by the WEDF's Kathryn Body.
Hello and welcome to this panel on the ethics and future of technology. My name is Kathryn and I'd like to start by personally welcoming everyone. It's wonderful to have you here and to be joined by Dr. Michael Klenk and Dr. Simon Longstaff to discuss some of the most pressing issues of our time. First of all, I would like to begin by asking you both, what is ethics? Now, I'm sure this is a question that you quite often dread as philosophers. As we both know, there's no straightforward answer. However, Simon, if you'd like to start off, that would be wonderful.
Well, we're possibly disagreeing about this, but in my world, ethics is a conversation that emerges in response to a question which Plato ascribes to Socrates, which is, what ought one to do? So it's that area of deliberation which surrounds any form of human choice. And it's based on a recognition that those choices collectively shape the world in which we live. So it's quite a profound question in that sense. And it's distinguished in, I suppose, most significantly that it's a practical question. So life presses in on us. We have to make choices within real time. And that's where we go to try and provide some structure for how we go about doing so.
Right. And why do you think it's important to consider these kinds of questions when developing and using data-driven technologies, and when organizations and companies in particular are using people's data? Why do you think it's important that they ought to consider ethical questions in this process?
Well, the first thing is that, and you've picked up very much as you ought on the word ought itself, the mere fact that you can do something doesn't mean that you should do something. And the degree of responsibility that attaches to your decision-making is, I think, relative to the amount of power associated with the choices you make. And these technologies are extraordinarily powerful and are only likely to become more so. And so we need to be quite deliberate in our thinking about what it is we choose to do and how we justify it, and particularly the degree to which we apply some measure of ethical restraint. I mean, if you think about it, technological mastery, which is absent any kind of ethical restraint, that almost always lies at the root of all forms of tyranny. So it's about having a principled basis for deciding as much what we do not do as what we do.
I'd like to pick up on your notion of restraint there. I think it's very important that organizations have an awareness of not just the short-term implications of what they're creating, but also the long-term implications. And I think you're absolutely right to assert that we need to have some kind of restraint on these issues.
And also a sense of our responsibility even for the unintended consequences. So we often think about one of the paradigm examples is the person who manufactures say a firearm, a gun, and often it's said, oh, well, it's not guns that kill people, it's people. And so you've often seen manufacturers washing their hands, disavowing any responsibility. But of course, as the technology develops, even around something like firearms, it is possible, for example, to have fingerprint readers so that you can constrain the use of the weapon by those who are not authorised or approved to do so. And if you as a technologist don't take those ethical considerations into account when you are actually designing these elements and the affordances that come with them, then in some senses you become culpable for their subsequent misuse because you could have made a decision to do otherwise. And I think this is a really important set of considerations that have to be translated from, if you like, the philosophical realm into the technical realm so that the engineers who produce these things are as ethically literate as they are technically literate.
Yes, I agree completely, and I think complacency cannot be excused, especially with the rate that technology is developing. And I really, yeah, the points you picked up on are wonderful. Thank you. Michael, would you like to start off by giving us an idea of what ethics means to you?
Yeah, sure. I think basically I'm on the same page with what Simon said here. That it's about Socrates' question about what we ought to do, or how we ought to live, or how should I live so that others can bear living with me. And so I think that's the ethical question, also how it looks like from an internal perspective when you and I ask ourselves, how should we go about living our lives? And I think I would trust that everyone recognizes this ethical question, because everyone faces difficult questions and choices in our lives. So whether it's about what career choice we make, what partner we choose, whether we stay with a partner or we leave a partner, and if you're conscious about climate change and the well-being of animals, then even like what you eat for dinner becomes a very kind of loaded question. How should I handle these questions? So I think I'm on the same page here with Simon. I also what I wanted to add was that I think that once you go into business, sometimes it becomes obscured that this is a question we all face, and people might say, well, once I'm a businessman or once I'm a developer, then there's only certain types of considerations that are relevant for me. How ought I live? How should I live? How should I design things? And then perhaps you have only one criterion in mind, which is market success or monetary success. And what I stress with my students, for example, when we talk about engineering ethics, is that you're giving a particular answer to that question, how should I live? By saying, well, I should build a product that sells the most, or that gathers the most data, which makes most business sense. So what I wanted to say is sometimes this idea of ethics gets narrowed down to only allowing for specific considerations. But in doing so, you are doing ethics. You only choose to focus on a very narrow set of considerations, monetary success or whatnot. And really, all of the other considerations, I think, are still relevant.
Do you think by narrowing down those considerations, and for instance, by only concentrating on monetary success, you would be acting unethically rather than ethically? Do you think it's important to try and create an awareness that we're not just functioning on a day-to-day basis as non-thinking subjects? We are, and we ought to be considering others as well as ourselves. And in the development of technology in particular, how do you think it's possible to encourage businesses and organizations to take genuine responsibility rather than compliance in itself?
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question. It's I want to say three things. First, are we acting? Are we making a mistake when we focus narrowly on only a specific set of concerns? I think that's a very deep question. I think in many cases the answer is yes. For example, when I focus on my own self-interest and my only, for example, my monetary success at the expense of others, when I harm others and take that into account willingly, or as Simon said, also unintentionally, perhaps, if I have a lot of power, I should try my best to foresee the consequences, then I think I'm acting wrongly, or people, when you do that, you're acting wrongly. But that's a large question that perhaps we can also discuss later about, how to determine what's right or wrong in ethics. And then the second question you asked is how can we encourage businesses to take ethics seriously, right? And I think there's two. There's a very easy answer, but perhaps not a satisfactory answer. And the easy answer is that people care about ethics. And you see that with the sustainability movement in the last years, now with the diversity topics. And I think and businesses and people who work in businesses. I mean, businesses are full of people, right? And they notice that these things are important. I think that's one thing, which is why they also exert their influence in a company, and that the company takes care of the diversity and sustainability issues. Another thing is that they might just be reacting to market demand, and clients care about sustainability and clients care about diversity. So that's a good reason, self-interested reason for businesses to care about that. I think in that sense, it's easy to get companies to care about ethics because we say, well, your clients care about it. I'm not sure whether that's a fully satisfactory way, because when you and I discuss ethics and you ask me, perhaps we're friends, and you ask, well, what should I do in that situation? And I'm going to tell you, well, here's what other people will think about you. Well, that's partly relevant, but it's not the whole story, right? I should also say, well, independently of what these people think, I think what really matters is that. Right? So, yeah, so an easy answer, but perhaps not fully satisfactory.
I agree. I think when you and I talk about ethics, and Simon, let me know if you agree with this point, we want it to be authentic and sincere, and we want the intention to matter just as much as the outcome. Is there anything that you would like to add on that, Simon?
I think there's something worth noting, and both you and Michael have touched on it, and it's to do with the question about thinking about what you do. I'd argue that the greatest enemy against ethics is not the deliberately wicked individual. I mean, we have this idea in life of some people who are, they've got black hats and handlebar moustaches and all the rest, and that they're really evil sort of geniuses. But that's not the source of most of the problem. In fact, most of the ethical failure that you see is a product of basically good, decent people who make bad decisions. You ask, well, why do they do it? I mean, if they're not wicked, how does it happen? And the answer is, the most likely cause is that when you ask someone why they did these things, too often you'll hear them say, well, firstly, that at the time they did it, they didn't see it. And you ask, well, why didn't you see it? And they say, well, everybody was doing it. Or that's just the way things were done. And
Right.
so there's a kind of unthinking custom and practice which people key into because it makes life slightly easier. If you don't have to think about it, but you just follow the grain, then life's all right. It's not too troubling. And this is why ethics is a largely disturbing area. Many people move away from it because they know that once they engage, their life will be more difficult. There's also, I think, the things you talk about so naturally about all people are interested in ethics. I think it's true, if I make an assumption here around your ages, that it is far more likely that younger people will have a natural affinity with this. But I can tell you, people, I'm a fair bit older than I think both of you, and people my age and older, particularly men, are actually not that interested. They've traditionally been more interested in compliance, in obedience to rules, in terms of their own mastery of what they're good at. And so when you point to them towards something which is more challenging, unless they're very expert in it, they tend to dismiss it as being unimportant.
Yes.
I mention these things because I do think there are some very significant cultural issues to do with how we think about ethics and how we respond to it, which we need to understand, not to criticise people like that, but to help them to come along, if you like, in the journey and to achieve that Socratic ideal of the examined life, not a life which is just a matter of unthinking custom and practice.
Yes, that's very interesting, and it's something I wanted to touch upon. I agree entirely that I think now more than ever, as the age groups move further down the scale, there is more awareness around even the word ethics and about considerations about what we ought to be doing and how we should be acting. But it would be absolutely right to say that we come from a long history where there has been continued compliance to behaviours where there's been no real contemplation about whether or not it's the right thing to do. Simon, would you mind touching upon the banality of evil here? Hannah Arendt's infamous idea that complacency makes you just as culpable for an action.
Yes, I mean, this is a famous phrase associated with the philosophy of Hannah Arendt. It comes from a particular work, Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is looking at the trial of Adolf Eichmann, and the sense that you don't have to look for a terrible monster to find the source of evil in the world, that it can be as mundane as a person who is meticulously ensuring that the trains run on time, and the kind of precision around that. And so it's quite a serious question for every human being in that sense, to think about how one might become complicit in serious wrongdoing, the kind of wrongdoing which even attracts the word evil in the non-philosophical sense, more in the cultural sense. And it's so easy to become part of that world without even realizing that it is there, because you don't look, you don't sense, you don't admit to yourself that life is more complex than perhaps you wish it to be. And of course, this is a slightly off the point, but when people are confronted by the genuine ethical dilemma, which is in principle undecidable, this really challenges our desire for certainty and clarity. And so the siren call of the fundamentalist in politics or in religion or in any other area, who says to you, well, actually, you don't have to think about this. You just do what I tell you. Just follow the rules, or I'll make the decision for you. A lot of people say, oh, thank you. They just say, I don't want to have to bear the burden of my own freedom with this endless succession of decisions. And as you were saying, along with Michael, and Michael was making the point, what you're going to eat today or tonight, there is an ethical decision when you make, if you go to the supermarket and maybe you have as simpler choices between the eggs from free-range chickens or those which are horribly caged birds. If you stop and ask yourself, well, what should I do now? Then you are doing ethics. The trouble is that many people, in a very banal sense, will just reach out with their left hand and pick up this one rather than that one. And they have no sense that they have inadvertently contributed to massive suffering, because it never really touches upon their own immediate life.
Absolutely. And do you think there's a very immediate risk here of that happening in the technological sphere, when in the process of developing new technologies, there isn't the ethical infrastructure to be able to deal with it? Michael,
sorry. So did you want to move on to Michael?
Michael, is this something that you're looking at in your research at the moment, at the relationship between and machines?
Sorry, Kathryn, I didn't get the relationship between what?
That's right. Is this something that you're concentrating on at the moment, the relationship between human beings and machines and how they're thinking?
Yeah, certainly. So one of the areas that I focus right now in the philosophy of, or the ethics of technology, is kind of human-machine interaction and how we can interpret that in terms of what good interaction looks like. And we can start with looking at good interaction between human beings, and to a sense translate that to interactions between more and more autonomous machines and ourselves. But I think before I wanted to go into that, I found several things interesting in what Simon also said. Can you go back to that for a second?
Absolutely. Simon, would you like to pick up on that?
First, what I found interesting was that, so Simon mentioned, I think that's perfectly right, that people do not consider themselves to be bad people. And so if you raise the issue of ethics, you won't find anyone who thinks, well, I'm certainly culpable here, and I should really, do my homework in that area. Because everyone thinks, well, I'm actually doing quite okay because I'm trying my best as well. I think people do think that and generally they probably do try their best. So what I find two interesting issues when we talk about the need for ethics with companies in the technology sector especially is we can emphasize the need and we can stress that everyone is doing ethics all the time, wittingly or not. Can we provide clear answers? I think that's the second step often that people, so what I see with my students, for example, is first a great willingness and awareness. Yeah, ethics actually is relevant. Now I want to learn everything about it and I want to do the right thing. Now you tell me what I ought to do. You help me figure it out. And then Simon touched upon this. It just gets more complicated. Because you see all the different considerations at play and how they perhaps might lead to dilemmas, how they're incompatible. It's not really an ethics issue, but usability of a technology versus privacy considerations. These kind of two things often conflict. How do you resolve that? And there are no easy answers. So that is a problem when you ask, how is ethics relevant for companies? How can you show it to them that it's, or perhaps when you think about ethics consulting, or consulting in other areas is about solving issues and developing or providing a product or a service to a company. When the service is to make things more complicated, then that's interesting, and I'm interested in how to solve that problem. But
and Simon, I believe you've tried to provide some answers to these questions in your argument for a universal ethical framework for developing technologies and using data. Would you like to just provide us a bit of an introduction to that?
Well, if I, like Michael, I'll just wind back a little bit before I go straight to your question, Kathryn, because I think there's some things worth unpacking, both about technology and corporations and ethics. If you look at what technology actually is, it's not so much the artifacts that we produce. It's a particular type of rationality which is defining of technology. It's a form of rationality called calculative rationality. And it begins its life at this pivotal moment in philosophy, really the launch of the European Enlightenment, in the meditations of the French philosopher René Descartes, who engages in this extraordinarily radical act of skepticism where he seeks to deny the certainty of anything other than that about which he can be absolutely certain. And I think we all know, just through popular culture, he eventually comes to the point where he says, well, the one thing that he can be certain about is that he is having the thoughts that he is thinking. And the reason why that's so radical is because what it does is it replaces a worldview which had preceded his time, in which certainty was established by something outside of the human being themselves. People would sacrifice to the gods or look to do kind of magic of one kind or another through prayer or sacrifice or ritual. There was something other and larger than oneself that determined the way things were. And if you could speak to or control that, that's how you'd get certainty. This moment of technology is born in saying, actually, no, it's not something other than ourselves. It's us that can establish certainty and control. And so mathematics becomes the queen of the sciences, and our technology grows. And we think, if only we can order things up and control them. So that's what's at the seed. Now, why that's so important is that if you think of technology not just as a series of things that we make, but as a whole form of rationality, then you see this control, the desire to control things flowing through then into a corporation, which is impersonal in some senses. It can be a calculating machine. Sometimes some people say it's just got a single view, which is to try and maximize profits and other things. There's lots of debates about that. But where it becomes really interesting is when you start to think about what's different between us and the machine or the corporation. And that is that, let me give you an example. At the moment, you can use AI and data in order to diagnose certain cancers, for example, with a much greater degree of accuracy than any human being can bring to bear. So we have that capacity through the machine to be certain, if you like, about the nature of the particular disease you have, even to the point where it can say what it's likely to be for your prognosis. But only another human being can put their hand on your shoulder and tell you that you're going to die. And in telling you that, they know what it means to be mortal. You know that they understand what it means to be mortal. And none of the systems, none of the machines, the AI or other things can really know that. They might simulate it, but even if they're brilliant at simulation, we'll know that they don't really know what it means to be mortal. Just as the corporation, as a legal fictional entity, doesn't really know what it's like to be mortal, because a corporation is in principle immortal. So that's the background of what we started to think about. We said, well, okay, if there's this great power, it's going to be wielded in many cases by these non-natural fictional persons, the corporation, are there some basic principles that we ought to put in place? And the first of them is one that we've already invoked, that can does not imply ought. The mere fact that you can do something doesn't mean that you should. And then there's a series of others around responsibility and looking at, trying to do the maximum good for the greatest number. So they're things which are familiar to philosophers, just ordinary people in the street would know about them, and various things about the kind of care and concern you bring. And I think Michael was probably heading towards some of these when he was saying, well, okay, if we've got you on the journey where you start to say, well, I'm at least interested in ethics and maybe I can bear the uncertainty, which I think is the answer, Michael, to this, is not to pretend to a certainty that doesn't exist, but to actually say up front that there's something mildly heroic about the human condition in which we are compelled to make choices, but always in conditions of radical uncertainty. And we should accept that. It's okay. We don't have to always be certain. Maybe that's the part we have to let go. And then bring these ethical considerations into bear. And I might throw them to you and through you to Michael about some of the different frameworks that people then seek to use in order to answer these dilemmas.
Absolutely. And do you think sometimes it can be met with frustration that there are no clear-cut answers a lot of the time? And what I suppose what I mean is that for somebody who's quite practically minded and who has a technological viewpoint, who likes to be able to measure and calculate things, to acknowledge that we are fundamentally mortal and that we are human can be perhaps not a difficulty, but something that they don't always feel is relevant to discussions about technology.
Well, that's why you dismiss ethics. You'd say, well, if it's not going to give me the certainty I desire, why would I bother? But of course, even the most person steeped in technology or mathematics, they'll know about Gödel's incompleteness theorem. They'll know about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle in physics. I mean, they know that uncertainty at some very profound sense is written into the structure of the universe. It's just that we have not found ways to cope with it because we cling to the possibility that everything can be calculated and controlled. But, well, it's not true. It just can't be. It's at the level of the structure of the universe and reason, there's some measure of uncertainty. You might believe in truth and compassion, and you might be totally committed to truth and totally committed to compassion, and know if you're going to tell someone the truth, you're going to hurt them. If they are equally weighted and pulling in the opposite direction, when your mother says, how do I look wearing this new hat or whatever, and you say, oh, what am I going to tell her? You have to live with the fact that it may be undecidable by anything or anybody. So that is, I know it's deeply frustrating, but my plea to people who are building these technologies and the AI is, don't let the fact that there may not always be absolute certainty, don't use that as an excuse to disengage from the discourse. Instead, what you need to do is to enjoy the freedom that it actually accords you to be responsible and to make choices, but have a principled base of doing it. It's not just a flipping of the coin or just decide what we feel like in the morning. This has such profound implications for actual people that you need to become as masterful as you can in the messiness of it all, but you should become literate in these ways of thinking rather than dismissing it all as irrelevant.
You're muted, Kathryn.
My apologies. The failings of modern technology. Michael, I was just saying, was there anything you'd like to add on Simon's point?
Yeah, I think on that notion of whether people might get frustrated, I think it's not so much with the frustration that they have to make a decision or have to deliberate about a decision. It's more about whether ethics as a perhaps academic discipline, or perhaps as somebody who wants to coach people in doing ethics or whatnot, whether that part can deliver anything towards an answer. I think everyone that I meet in the engineering ethics classes, for example, they would think, well, it's basically up to you. It's like your opinion. It's like your taste of ice cream, more or less. If you like it, then you go for it. If you don't like it, you don't go for it. And if you then tell people, well, there's perhaps more to it. There's more considerations to take into account than your likes and dislikes. Then I think you create an expectation that you are able to give an answer, and you help people to figure out how to take all of these considerations into account. And so I think if there's a frustration, it's frustration with making the picture more complicated than do whatever you like or what you think is best, and then not saying, well, here's an algorithm for solving the decision problem. Okay, but that's dwelling on the issues.
I think quite often in ethics, I just think quite often in ethics there's a tendency for ethicists and philosophers to choose one path, one particular direction that they feel is the right one. And what I found very interesting about providing a universal framework for ethics in your paper, Simon, is that you've looked at how we can achieve a reflective equilibrium of bringing together many ethical perspectives.
Yeah.
Is this something you could elaborate on, Terry?
Yeah. I mean, philosophers often get into very, very heated disagreements about which particular ethical language ought to be given priority. And so you'll find some who are totally committed to the notion that you must resolve every question by appeal to duty. And you'll hear people like Kantian formalism will be put out. There'll be others who'll say, oh, no, it's not about duties, it's about consequences. It's the greatest good for the greatest number, or the maximization of preferences and things of that kind. And then there'll be others who come from a family group where they say, actually, it's not about either of those things. It's more about who do we become as the choices we make are unfolding. It's as if we're made of wax or clay, and every choice we make leaves a little imprint. So you get these kind of, at least in the Western philosophy, and you see a translation of this into the East, you get these families of ideas who squabble amongst themselves about which is right or wrong. Some years ago, it seemed to me that actually there were times when you didn't actually need to decide between those things, that there were some options which were perfectly consistent both with duty and with consequences and with one's character, with virtue. And so why wouldn't you try and apply a framework which at least sees how that might work together? Because if you have developed a kind of literacy in multiple languages for thinking about ethical questions, it's much more powerful, because then you're speaking to a whole range of people who might have a tendency towards one or more of these things. So it's a bit like if you walked into a room full of Spaniards and you only spoke to them in English because that was your language, they'd be scratching their heads and wondering what the hell's going on. So if you walk into a group of engineers and you only talk to them in one of the ethical languages, when they're distributed amongst different ways of thinking about these things, then you don't do your cause a particular service. So what we try to argue is, rather than having to spend all your time resolving who is ultimately right in these squabbles between philosophers, not to say they're unimportant, let's try and explore ethical questions with a view to seeing whether there might be options that satisfy multiple criteria, which means that no one has to be especially dissatisfied. Now, that doesn't mean there'll always be an answer of that kind. But it's worth at least looking. And then what you come to is the really interesting thing is, well, how do you translate this into the kind of practical tools that data engineers and others want to use? And I've been working for a few years on a fascinating project with the Aga Khan Foundation and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade from Australia in Afghanistan, which is all about using big data to try and monitor the extent to which women's empowerment is actually proceeding in response to the kind of aid and development funds which are being put in place. Now, why would you want to do this? Because it's just too dangerous to go to Afghanistan and to get on the ground. And so this began by developing an ethics framework with some core principles. And what's been fascinating is now seeing the way in which the data engineers and data scientists are actually taking these principles and using technological means like hashing and other things to be able to give it practical effect. And so it's kind of living proof of the fact that it is indeed possible to take these principles and translate them into the language that scientists and engineers use. I imagine, Michael, you probably see this all the time with your students who are sort of asked to translate the work you're doing into things that they can actually use on the ground. And that's a source for me of great encouragement. In other words, even though we're pointing out some of the difficulties and the frustrations, there are also the counterexamples where you can actually see it working. And that goes to another really important principle that comes from Immanuel Kant, that ought implies can. That we're not actually asking people to do impossible things. We're asking people to do entirely possible, practical things, if only you get the foundations right.
Absolutely. And I suppose the beauty of that perspective as well is that you can capture as many cultural narratives as possible into that framework. So where you've got multitudes of differences of opinion across the globe, it is able to encompass all of them. Michael, is this something that you've come across in your research before?
Yeah, I think it's certainly right that we can find, because one of the questions you asked was about whether there are universal principles, and I think there's certainly fully agree that we can find actions or things that we ought to do that kind of any ethical theory would agree upon. So that when you ask, what should I do in this situation, the different kind of normative or ethical frameworks would give you similar or even the same answer. So in a very practical sense, I think, we make progress and we give concrete answers. And of course, the question why, so the justification or the explanation for why that option and not this other option, that may differ between theories, even though they come to the same result. And I would also agree, for all practical purposes, perhaps we can leave that out. But for theoretically or ethically, the justification for why you do something might also matter, and then there might be disagreement. But I fully agree that we can translate these considerations in ethics, and Simon put it, the different languages that people speak about ethics into concrete action.
Absolutely, and hopefully that way as well we can confront some of the hermeneutical barriers that are faced not only in technology but also when it comes to people understanding ethics as a discipline. I would love to go on further, but just to wrap up the discussion a little bit, Simon, I'd love to know your take on, do you think there is one single ethical question that organizations and people using technology on a day-to-day basis ought to be asking themselves in order to ensure that it's going in the right direction?
Great question, Kathryn. For me, it would probably come back to an older question about what is the purpose for which this technology has been created or deployed. And the language of purpose has been somewhat lost in recent years from where it started. So people talk about purpose these days often in the sense of it being an inspiring statement that makes people get out of bed in the morning and go to work. I'm thinking about the old Greek notion of telos, or the end of something. So the kind of classic syllogism is, you know, what is the purpose of a knife? The purpose of a knife is to cut. So what is a good knife? A good knife is a knife that cuts well. So I would begin by saying, ask yourself, what is the purpose in that sense, that deeper sense of purpose for which this technology is being created? And if I may offer a subsidiary question then around purpose, is that I wouldn't completely dissociate the question of the ends to be served from the means which are going to be used to secure them, because I think they're more intimately connected than sometimes people allow. They say, oh, well, the ends justifies the means, which is one of the most pernicious principles that's ever been uttered. There's a more subtle connection between ends and means. And so when I asked that question about purpose, I would be inviting people to think not just the end result, but what are the appropriate means that are part of that, which ought to be held in mind.
Thank you. And Michael, for you, what would be the one question that you would bring to the fore, or that you would like people to be more aware of when making ethical considerations about data and technology?
Yeah, I think second Simon's questions, I think they're great ones. I also think that you can ask, how would I like to be treated? And I think more and more of the technologies that we are creating become more and more autonomous, so that even though I wouldn't go as far as saying that they're full agents, like human agents, and I wouldn't say that they're humans, obviously, but we can at least describe them as if they're agents, and as if they're acting. And I would like to, I would encourage people to ask, how would you like to be treated in an interaction? And you can think about that, for example, when you look at your Netflix recommender system that suggests the next video to watch, next film to watch. That's a kind of interaction, and how would that interaction look like, ideally? So how would you like a friend to recommend videos to you? What kind of information should they draw on? What kind of information should they give when recommending movies to you? So that's a kind of a mundane example, but many of these interactions between us and between machines can be, I think, thought of in that direction. How would I like to be treated, and how should that interaction look like? And that determines to an extent how we design the machine.
Kathryn, could I come back with something slightly more poetic about how we might answer it, which is not so much a philosophical question? I was on a phone call to someone in France earlier this evening, and they're talking about technology, actually, and how we haven't yet quite worked out as a species how to raise our children in the way that they're healthy and happy. So how are we going to create these expert systems which are almost like our children? And the image it brought back, and this is the poetic part, is Mary Shelley's book Frankenstein, where effectively the creature that's created becomes monstrous, not because it's monstrous by nature, but because its creator rejects it. It cannot love or be loved by the being that brought it into existence. And so one somewhat poetic question that people might think a bit strange to ask is, will I love what I'm creating today in a decade's time, or will I regret and abandon it? And if you think that you couldn't love what you're making today in a decade or 100 years' time, then maybe that ought to be a reason to pause.
I think that's a wonderful way of putting it as well, and it really makes people consider the long-term implications of what it is they are putting out there into the world. That ultimately isn't just going to affect them, it's going to affect hundreds of thousands of millions of people. Michael, is there something you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I think even though we probably won't have time to discuss that in more detail, but I think with when you think about the kind of technology you would like to create that you will still love in 10 years' time, then that's a question of ethics. And I think what we really also need to do, and that perhaps it's time for another panel, is to think about a political philosophy of technology, because I can only do so much myself as a designer or an entrepreneur, and I'm operating within a certain framework and other institutions. And what we've done, I think it's great that we in the past years have focused on an ethics of technology a lot, but that's oftentimes focusing on the individual's perspective, the individual designer or the individual company. And we can begin to think about, I think, as a society, what kind of technology should we create? What kind of problems should we solve with technology? And so that kind of to get a political philosophy of technology started, that's perhaps also something that we can think about for the future.
Because these technological questions ultimately can't be solved by technology. They do require that issue. I do think, to be fair, in this whole area, we've been talking about the need for technologists to be more, if you like, philosophically literate. I think the rest of us also have to be more technologically literate. And that goes to your point about the quality of our societies and our capacity to make informed decisions. Because there's no, I mean, I think, Kathryn and Michael, I hope this doesn't sound overblown, but I do think that we're on the brink of civilizational change that's going to be ushered in because of the power of these technologies, and completely rethinking of the difference between jobs and work, and on so many levels. And I, like Michael, I think, question whether or not we have the political or institutional resources to cope with this. So one of the things I think we need to do is, just as much as we invest in physical and then technical infrastructure, we need to invest in the ethical infrastructure of our societies so that we can make good choices and not have suboptimal or worse outcomes as a result of having let that ethical infrastructure become degraded over time, as it has in a number of countries.
Absolutely, thank you very much. And I would love to continue discussing this in more detail with you, but sadly we have to now wrap up the panel. I'd like to thank you both for your contributions to the discussion. It's certainly provided some food for thought. And I'd like to thank everybody for listening in. It's wonderful to have you with us at the World Ethical Data Forum, and it's been wonderful talking with you. Thank you both very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you both.